Now I'll show you my video game system collection from the first half of the 90s. This generation really started out in 1989 with the Sega Genesis, NEC TurboGrafx-16, Nintendo Game Boy, and Atari Lynx. Now I didn't talk about the Atari Lynx in my last video because I don't have the original model that came out in 1989. I have the 1991 remodel called the Atari Lynx 2. The advantages the Lynx had over the Game Boy were color graphics and a backlit screen. The disadvantages were not having a very popular library of games. Game Boy had all the NES favorites such as Mario. Lynx just had its own thing. Some arcade ports, some original titles. Electro Cop is one of the most impressive looking games on it. It has 3D-like graphics even though it's only 8-bit. Most games on the Lynx are two-dimensional though, sort of like the 1990 handheld color game system, the Sega Game Gear. The Game Gear takes 2 more batteries than the Lynx and Game Boy, but it has some popular titles for it from its own makers series such as Sonic the Hedgehog. This is one reason the Game Gear did even better than the Atari Lynx. Also in 1990, SNK came out with their first console for this decade, called the Neo Geo Advanced Entertainment System. What they were trying to do here was make a console that actually looked just as good as the arcade machines at the time. Most systems before this were only half as good as the arcade machines graphically, while handhelds were half as good as the systems. The only reason this didn't really get high sales is because it was so expensive. High-powered machines take high-powered hardware, which cost a lot of money. But it came with a nice controller that was just like a real arcade joystick, even clicks like one. The next system to come out was in 1991, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Nintendo's next platform continued the trend of having very popular game series like Mario on it, and a nice controller. The competition between this system and the Sega Genesis was very strong in the 90s. Also, in 1991, Philips came out with their CDI. This remodel from 1994 is more of a console size, but the original model is very large. The games for this system aren't very good, but there are a couple okay games like Tetris. And a generic fighting game called Mutant Rampage Body Slam. It's just like Final Fight or Streets of Rage, which you would find on the Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo. They also made pretty funny but terribly programmed Zelda games and Mario game just because they had licensing rights from Nintendo. Originally, the CDI was going to be an add-on to the Super Nintendo for playing CDs on the system, sort of like Sega did with their Sega CD and NEC did with their Turbo Duo or TurboGrafx-16 CD add-on for their original form of this console. CD abilities for these systems added better graphics and sound. There's more they could do with them, like full motion video, CD quality music, etc. also holding more game data so they could add more levels to it. This didn't really help out much with the gaming though, so it didn't catch on very well. Didn't improve the system's abilities very much. That's why Nintendo probably decided it wasn't necessary. First they were working with Sony on it, then they switched to Philips, and they canceled both. So that's why the CDI and PlayStation have nothing really to do with Nintendo. In 1992, Watara came out with their handheld Supervision. This wasn't very successful as it was just like the Game Boy, except the games for it were pretty generic. There weren't a lot of popular games for it. Actually, none of them were really popular at all. And their protection wasn't very good. Exposed connector pins, and instead of a plastic case like these Game Gear and Game Boy ones, just a plastic sleeve. Tiger also was releasing handheld standalone games based off of popular franchises such as Sonic the Hedgehog, Marvel Comics characters like X-Men, and Disney. In 1993, Pioneer thought maybe the alternative to digital video CDs, which didn't have very good quality, would be to use Laserdiscs. They made a few games on Laserdisc, but this machine wasn't really a big video game console, although it was a very big piece of hardware. The best use out of it is really playing Genesis games on little add-on that you can get for it. Also in 1993, 3DO had Panasonic and Gold Star make consoles for them. Their goal was to make it so 32-bit was the next generation of graphics, and it didn't start out with very many games for it. Not having a good library of games makes a system fail, and in 1995, when they started getting more popular games for it, they were already being ported to PlayStation. So this system didn't last very long in the market. Also, in 1993, Atari came out with their Jaguar. Lots of buttons on the controller, 64-bit graphics that were more 32-bit, and were just trying to push too much too early. If they waited for the technology to get a little bit better, it would have looked better. In 1994, Sega decided to follow the trend of the Jaguar and 3DO and try to make the graphics better. So they added the 32X to the Sega Genesis. Looked a little bit better than Genesis, but people weren't really too excited about it, so they didn't make very many games for the 32X. Also in 1994, SNK released their Neo Geo CD. Since their AES was so expensive and that was making it so not many people were buying it, they decided to put games on CD format so it'd be cheaper to produce it. And give you a joypad instead of a joystick. This was a very good system when it comes to games, but since it had load times like any of these older CD systems, it sort of made people not as interested. They didn't want to wait for the action. And the last thing, besides Super Nintendo being able to add Game Boy playability and improve their graphics with just games without having to add extra hardware, making them very successful, Atari added the Jaguar CD to the Jaguar, which didn't really increase its abilities very much, and it looked pretty much just like 3DO and had even less games than most of these systems here. So this is the first half of the 90s. It gets better in the second half.